Good morning, YouTube. This is Bastial, and this is my channel. Today I wanted to talk about America and war. When I say American war, I do not mean the American Revolution. I don't mean the Civil War. I mean the wars that have taken place more or less within the last 10 years. The Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, and as an extension of that, the drone strikes into Pakistan, Libya, Yemen, and Somalia. The Iraq War was initiated by President George W. Bush in 2003. Uh, it, we initiated a war in that country, and there's some dubious claims about WMD is sort of a random generic term, weapons of mass destruction. We're not quite sure what those weapons were because it turns out that they didn't exist. But we were attacked on 9/11 by mostly Saudi terrorists. You know, there were some Egyptians. They were, as far as we know, instructed by a Saudi who lived in Afghanistan. So, of course, we can draw this conclusion that, you know, Saudi terrorists, under the command of a Saudi in Afghanistan, we should obviously invade Iraq because they are dangerous. And the invasion of Iraq met overwhelming support from every side of the political spectrum. You know, obviously, with the exception of libertarians and probably socialists, one of the things that we oddly stand together with in some cases. But you know, you have very prominent Democrats. You know, Hillary Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid. You know, standing up and saying that Saddam Hussein is dangerous. He has weapons of mass destruction. We need to have a military intervention to liberate the oppressed people of Iraq, and hopefully dismantle this arsenal that he has apparently accumulated. And this was supported by almost all of society for about a year or two, give or take, a year and a half, I guess. And then there was a about 2003, you know, a year before the presidential elections, people just started taking on the streets. You know, you just had this massive, enormous crowds of people protesting the war in Iraq, protesting the war in Afghanistan. You know, get out now, no blood for oil. You remember? I mean, I'm old enough to remember it. Most of you people who would be watching a video with this title are probably old enough to remember it. And you know, John Kerry lost to George W. Bush. He was a poor candidate, a poor choice, just like the way Mitt Romney's a poor candidate choice. And you know, the protests continued. No blood for oil. You know, there's no WMD, so we should withdraw. There's no exit strategy. There's really no. You know, we're here in this nation-building exhibition, and really, there's almost no defined set of goals or some maxim that we have to reach realistically before we can withdraw. And we only withdrew because the government of Iraq told us to, because they told Obama to, not because Obama wanted to. And then after Barack Obama, you know, Barack Obama in his lead up to his presidency promised to end the wars in the Middle East, and he promised to change foreign policy. You know, he went to the Middle East on a mission of goodwill. It was one of the first things he did as president. And since then, the massive war protests have totally died. You can see like small street corner protests against the wars. Most of them are libertarians and socialists. The left wing, the Democrats who made up that large crowd of people protesting, as it turns out, they were just protesting George W. Bush. They were just protesting the Republican establishment of war. And now that there's the Democratic establishment of war, couldn't matter less. But I think it's important that we look to the suffering that our war has inflicted on the nation of Iraq. And I think the best way, one of the best ways, is to go to the Iraqis themselves and see how they've responded. And there's a really excellent blog. I'm sure you could read it online, or you could buy the book. The book is called Baghdad Burning, and it's authored by an Iraqi blogger, a female Iraqi named, well, her screen name is Riverbend. I'm not sure what her real name is. I'm not sure if that's ever revealed. But between about August of 2003 and March of 2007, when her and her family actually fled Iraq, Riverbend and her family, she just notes all of the various destruction, all the tragedies, and all the horrific things that happened in Iraq as a result of the war. You know, the total collapse of their infrastructure, the rise of crime, just the horrible consequences of the war in Iraq, and how. And I mean, if you watch the news, nothing has gotten much better. So you go from this almost totally modern infrastructure, like modern healthcare system, and America comes to like spread democracy, I guess, and just blows this place back into the early 20th century, economically, I mean. And you know they were almost totally modern, even socially. There's a full egalitarian treatment of men and women under Saddam's Iraq. No, I'm not saying he wasn't a dictator. He was a terrible person, and he killed thousands, if not millions, of innocent people and started unjust wars. I'm not discrediting that. But was America better? Was that alternative better? Absolutely not. I cannot say here on the other side of the Iraq War that our intervention in the country was better off for them in the long run. Not at all. They were probably been better off just waiting for Saddam Hussein to die rather than doing what we did. But okay, so Riverbend and her family fled to Syria in 2007. I would imagine now they're fleeing to Beirut because of what's happening in Syria now with the I guess it's a civil war. So we're out of supposedly standing down in Iraq, even though we have I think it's 50,000 troops in the country. And what has surprised me the most in the midst of all this is the failed promises of President Barack Obama. Now let me say this: I have been a libertarian my whole life. No, I'm sorry, not my whole life, obviously. Since I've reached the legal voting age, as soon as I turned 18, I registered in the Libertarian Party. I am no longer in the party, but I'm still a libertarian. And I voted for Barack Obama in 2008 because with what Obama was saying about, you know, these wars, you know, we shouldn't be in these wars, we should bring the troops home. I was like, yeah, you know, under Obama, we wouldn't have all these stimulus packages for all these big evil corporations because Democrats hate big evil corporations. Why would they want to give them money? And our military budget would sizably decrease because we'd be pulled out of all these wars. And so I supported Obama. He said many good things, and he seemed to agree with my moral conscience, and I approved of the things that he was saying. But in 2009, Obama increased the amount of Marines in Afghanistan by 4,000 and the number of Army troops by 4,000, so about 8,000 troops surged. And he said this in 2009, and I quote, "At the end of this process, I'm going to be able to present to the American people in very clear terms what exactly is at stake, what we intend to do, how we're going to succeed, how much it's going to cost, and how long it's going to take." The answers to those questions have not been answered in any way since March of 2010. The surge hasn't increased stability in Afghanistan in any way, and American troops are expected to return home by 2014, which is long after Bush's timetable and long after Obama's promises. And even then, like, the idea that they are going to come home by 2014 is a projection. It's not a promise. I hope they do, but you know, we're there like twice as long as we should have been. Or, I'm sorry, we shouldn't have been there at all. Pardon me. Also, one of the strange, America just has all these strange things about its wars. One of our things that's shunned by the rest of the world and even by many people in the U.S. Something else that Democrats have been very hypocritical about is Guantanamo Bay. Obama, of course, promised he would close Guantanamo Bay when he came to office, and he did. To his credit, that was one promise that he did fulfill. However, in March of 2011, he did open it again and business continued as usual. But in 2007, when Obama was running for president, he said, and I quote, "Our legitimacy has been reduced by having Guantanamo Bay open." This was when he was debating other Democrats in the primaries, in the Democratic primaries. Again, something else that he's backtracked on, something else that he's betrayed his original promises, just like, ending the wars, cutting the national debt, like all that nonsense that he spouted off in 2007, and is now 2007, 2008, and now as totally nothing has come to fruition of his original plans, except for maybe Obamacare, to some extent. And in terms of Guantanamo Bay, in terms of philosophy, there's not much I can say. It's wrong to torture people. We shouldn't be in these countries where we're taking these people from and putting them into Guantanamo Bay in the first place. So I really don't see the need for this place to exist if we shouldn't be overseas anyway. But I'll get to that later. In one of the great anti-war heroes is a politician from Texas, a Republican named Ron Paul. Now, Ron Paul is very, very anti-war in Iraq, anti-war in Afghanistan, and he pointed out during the Republican primary debates last year, at the very end of last year, I think November of 2011, he was pointing out that it is actually America's fault for provoking attacks or provoking hostility, rather than what the other Republican primary frontrunners said, which was that it's a clash of civilizations. It's more along the Samuel Huntington lines of they just don't like Western culture, they don't like our way of life, and so they want to initiate war against us and destroy us, which is totally ridiculous. And I'll tell you why. Because in terms of civilization, in terms of what is really antithetical to Islamic civilization, I would say that in almost every case that communist China, that communist North Korea are far more hostile and far more local to the Islamic world than the United States is. Obviously, if we hadn't interfered in these people's polities, in these people's lives, there wouldn't be this sort of direct hostility where people where these extremists and these terrorists will cite specific examples of injustices committed by the United States against their people. And I think that on a philosophical basis that communist China is far more distant from the philosophies of Islamic Arabs than the mostly Christian Americans. Despite how materialistic we are still people of the book in the Islamic paradigm. We're still Christians, we're still allowed to practice our religion. Atheism is a little bit more shaky in the Islamic interpretation. And not to mention this sort of subjection, because there's a large Muslim minority in China, the Uyghurs and the Hui, two different ethnic groups, but they're still Muslim. And they're marginalized a lot because on the basis of their religion, the same way that Christians in China are marginalized than any other religious group, really, Buddhists and whatnot. But because China doesn't venture into the Islamic countries, there's no backlash against them. So if it's just a clash of civilizations, if it's just a war of philosophies, then I don't see how Muslims would find it, or these extremist Muslims would find it useful to engage in war with a country like across the world on the other side of the planet than it would be with a very local threat that espouses Marxist Maoist communism, which is far more hostile to Islamic theology than democracy. And so that philosophy that Ron Paul espouses, Rick Santorum, the social conservative, called irresponsible, was the word that he used. And I find, like, and I thought then and I think now that invading these countries just on the drop of a hat, just because we think that they have something or based on some dubious claims, I think that's really irresponsible. And the fact that we just hang around for another decade, even though we it was a mistake. That is also irresponsible. In terms of being irresponsible, these war hawks have no room to speak whatsoever. In fact, that any of these people are still taken seriously means that the political establishment is very much working in favor of politicians, because the extent to which they failed us would be regarded as unacceptable in any other place. But that's my 2 cents. Now, how do we solve this problem? We have a problem of we have a habit of going into all these different countries without formally declaring war, without Congress formally declaring war, and just messing everything up and just destroying things. We did it in Korea, we did it in Vietnam, we did it in Grenada, we did it in Iraq the first time in 1990, 1991, and then now we have the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. And this is just something that America does. Republican, Democrat, the Democratic liberal hero John F. Kennedy was the one who started military operations in Vietnam. I mean, it's everyone. And Obama drags out these wars. It's everyone. It's part of America. It's not part of conservative or liberal. It's just part of America. And that's a serious problem. We've always really been imperialists. I mean, between seizing parts of Mexico in the mid-19th century, trying to invade, starting to start a draft to invade Canada in the in and around
The War of 1812. I mean, just these totally explicitly imperialistic ideas that have been embedded in us really from the beginning. I mean, their founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, people who considered Cuba to be really part of the United States. Just really, in reality, it's part of the United States. We just have to get it away from Spain. And we control, as a result of the Spanish-American War, we control Guam and we control Puerto Rico still. We used to control the Philippines until Japan invaded that, and then we liberated the Philippines for real that time. Whereas in the case of Spain, we liberated them and then took control of them. And we've pretty much always been that way since the beginning of our country. And so I would recommend a radical change in foreign policy, not that whatever it was that Obama promised us in 2007. I mean a real change in foreign policy. Of course, as a libertarian, it's going to be free trade, no protectionism, no military intervention, no military adventures unless it's in self-defense, and if it has congressional approval. But this is our fault, more or less. I agree with Ron Paul that the enormous amount of hostility towards Americans by Muslims, by Muslim extremists, and by Persians or whoever we've managed to piss off in the last 200 years. If I'm forgetting some group of people, I apologize. I do mean to include you. We need to radically change that. Have a policy of trade. Export whatever we like, import whatever we like, no duties, no tariffs, no protectionism, no military intervention anywhere. And to really drive this point home, I wanted to recommend a book called We Who Dared to Say No to War. Now, this book is really an anthology of writings of Americans since 1776, since the War of 1812, forgive me, to the present. And it's basically the writings of various Americans from both the left and the right who are writing against war. And, one of the first ones is by Daniel Webster, who's writing against a draft that was being talked about so they could have enough manpower to invade Canada. Just this totally, and this is around the War of 1812, around the founding of this country. Just already we're starting these imperialist adventures. And We Who Dare Say No to War is co-edited by two people, Murray Polner, who is a leftist, and Thomas E. Woods, who is he's a libertarian from the Austrian School of Economics. So he's a right-winger. So you have both a left-winger and a right-winger co-editing this anthology, this anthology of writings against war. These are all Americans.
The only rules would be that you cannot be a communist and you cannot be a fascist. Those are their rules going into who they would decide would be included in the book. And I would very much recommend you reading it. I'm going to link it in the description below. It's only about $10 on Kindle if you so inclined to read it, but I would really, really recommend it. Feel free to leave a comment below regarding your if you want to scream at me for being anti-America, or if you agree with the premise of my arguments that we shouldn't be interfering in all these other countries abroad. Let's get some opinions going. Let's get some ideas rolling. Let's get the discussion flowing. I think that this is something that we really need to talk about. That we need to talk about the role of the United States and the effect of our military intervention in the world. Thank you very much for sitting through my 20-minute rant. And as always, keep fighting the good fight.